Hello and welcome to the presentation Introduction to Piano Pedagogy for Children. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I started my piano education at the age of 5 in Ukraine, in the music school which was subsidized by the government. I was a very young beginner as most of the students started piano studies there at the age of 7 or 8 years old. When I began lessons, I already knew how to read basic notation thanks to my older sister. So my teacher started teaching me to play different pieces right from the first lesson. Looking back, I cannot say I really enjoyed practicing, but I did love piano lessons and I wanted to become a teacher one day. My piano training continued for 20 long years. After music school, for 5 years I attended a music college, graduating with a bachelor degree. I then continued studying at a conservatory for another 5 years, earning a master's degree. During all these 20 years of studies, I had at least 2 individual piano lessons each week, plus numerous group lessons such as music theory, music history, polyphony, music form, choir, as well as accompaniment and ensemble. I graduated with 4 majors: piano performance, piano pedagogy, accompaniment, and chamber orchestra. But pedagogy became my true passion from the very beginning. During my years of study at college and conservatory, I had intensive pedagogy training with wonderful pedagogues. This consisted of group sessions every week, studying existing children's repertoire, teaching under the supervision of my master teacher, observing numerous master classes, as well as reading hundreds of books about piano pedagogy and performance. I couldn't wait to start teaching on my own. In my imagination, I would be the best piano teacher ever. These expectations were crushed at the very first lesson with a new beginner. Within the first few minutes of the first lesson, I realized that my student was bored and didn't want to learn the way I offered. I thought, this kid is not smart enough. I am talking about simple things and he doesn't get it. He is bored and doesn't remember anything. I struggled for a while and then I realized it wasn't the child's fault, but probably mine. I was wondering if other piano teachers have similar struggles with their beginners. Yes, most teachers do, and this is partially due to some common deficiencies in young children. Underdeveloped musical abilities, lack of imagination and creativity. Children dislike classical music because they have little exposure to it. Many students also struggle with discipline, focus, and concentration. They don't know how to set goals and solve problems. Most have an excessive tension in their bodies, which doesn't allow them to enjoy playing the piano and freely express themselves. If most of these deficiencies affect the pace of learning, interest in lessons, and enjoyment, muscle tension is directly connected with developing in students important technical skills. As I experienced learning about technique and then teaching it in Ukraine and Russia, Eastern Europe, then in the United States, and in recent years in China, While giving teacher workshops in Western Europe, North Latin and South Americas, Asia, and Australia, I came to realization that teachers in different parts of the world approach the concept of piano technique very differently, even though it's rooted from the very same source. Piano technique evolved from the technique that was used for playing the ancestors of piano. The first keyboard instruments, such as clavichord and harpsichord. Clavichord and harpsichord technique focused on developing finger independence and an overly rounded hand shape. It required every finger to be raised above the key and then strike the key rapidly. The keys of the harpsichord and clavichord were very light. Keyboard pieces written for these instruments were short, and independent finger action was sufficient for graceful and ornamental Baroque music. The first piano was invented in Italy in 1700 by Bartolomeo Cristofori, an Italian musician and maker of the musical instruments. The new instrument, called the pianoforte, looked like a harpsichord, but it had completely different action. The keys were much heavier, and instead of quills plucking the strings, hammers would strike the strings to make the sound. Dampers covered the strings so the sound could stop whenever the key was released. The piano did not become popular for quite a long time. Its first big promoter was Muzio Clementi, an Italian composer, musician, and pedagogue. He was called the father of the piano because he was widely endorsing the piano and even founded a factory for mass production of these instruments. Clementi realized that piano was very different from the harpsichord and clavichord and required a special technique. Clementi wrote a book called The Art of Playing on the Pianoforte. In this book, Clementi emphasized that pianists cannot play with isolated fingers only, but must use their arms and body weight to support their fingers. Not all the musicians agreed with Clementi's principles of use of the body weight while playing the piano. Many performers insisted on the use of high-raised isolated fingers. They belonged to the finger technique school that was rooted in the harpsichord technique. Others claim that the body weight and the weight of the arm are enough for playing the piano and fingers action was completely inessential. These musicians were supporting the so-called weight school. Even though these debates about piano technique were happening centuries ago, today we still have followers of these two completely opposite technique schools. On this slide, the first demonstration video was taken at a conservatory in China 2 years ago. The sound created by the professor is very percussive, and there is a lot of tension in the hand and fingers. The next video was taken at a music studio in the USA. There is also no concern about the quality of the sound, even though the fingers aren't involved in sound production at all, only the weight. Most likely some finger work will be developed later, but the sound made in this introduction can hardly interest any beginner in exploring music making any further.
What we're going to do for the sleepy lion paw is all we're going to do is we're going to pick up our arm and let it and let it just flop down onto the keys. Now, as you can see, my fingers aren't really doing anything. They're just flopping down.
Clementi's contemporaries, Joseph Haydn and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, loved the new instrument pianoforte and wrote a lot of music for it. Even though it wasn't the instrument they devoted the majority of their compositions to, as Haydn was very engaged in writing symphonies and chamber music, while Mozart was occupied with composing operas. But both composers loved to experiment with the piano, exploring legato articulation with short slurs while trying to imitate the sounds of stringed instruments and voice on the piano. Haydn's and Mozart's piano sonatas were much longer than Baroque sonatas. Legato articulation was impossible to execute properly without shifting and distribution of the weight, but still, light and independent fingers prevailed over the use of body weight in these composers' composition and piano performance styles. The next in line was the great Beethoven, who was an independent thinker and his playing was ahead of his time. He was working for fullness of tone and was concerned that the power of the arm should back up the fingers. This was a quote from the book Famous Pianists and Their Technique by Reginald Garrigue, professor of the Eastman School of Music and a graduate of the Juilliard School with 4 degrees. It becomes clear that Beethoven used a combination of finger and weight technique schools for his own composition and performance styles, as well as in his teaching. Beethoven was a great teacher, and his philosophies and performance principles were followed by many of his talented pupils. The most famous of Beethoven's students was Carl Czerny, who wrote thousands of exercises and etudes, which, by the way, are not possible to perform without the support of the body weight, with isolated fingers only. This reinforced and followed the teachings of Beethoven. Following Beethoven's and Czerny's performance principles and teachings, in different parts of the world, many pianists were developing and supporting so-called unified modern technique, which was a golden middle between weight technique and isolated finger technique. Pianists as early as Liszt, Leschetizky, both of them were students of Czerny, Chopin and Schumann were already using the whole body along with independent fingers. Among the most famous and eminent students of Karl Czerny was Theodor Leschetizky, who played a huge role in the development of piano pedagogy and piano technique worldwide. As a pianist, Leschetizky combined the classical training of Czerny, the cantabile style of Chopin, and the brilliance of Liszt. These were also the qualities which were predominant in the playing of his pupils. After his studies with Czerny in Austria, Theodor Leschetizky went back to his native Poland, but shortly afterwards he was invited by his famous friend, the Russian pianist Anton Rubinstein, to move to St. Petersburg, where together they founded the first Russian conservatory. Leschetizky served as the dean of the piano department there for almost 3 decades, teaching many generations of musicians from all over the world. Among Russian pianists, Leschetizky is called the father of the Russian piano school. Leschetizky used to say he didn't have a specific method of teaching, but quite a few of his students wrote books, articles, and biographies about him and referred to his teaching philosophy and principles as the Leschetizky method. While some authors of these works focused on finger technique as a part of the method, the others were emphasizing the weight distribution and sound production, continuing to elaborate and develop the principles of the unified modern technique. Isabel Bingirova was a student of Leschetizky and a famous pianist and pedagogue. She was mostly recognized for training all her pupils with the approach designed to achieve expressive playing and beautiful tone. In the book, The Bingirova System of Piano Playing, the author, Robert Schick, summarized all the principles of the unified modern piano technique that Bingirova learned from Leschetizky. This book is based on detailed notes taken by the author during a decade of study under Bingirova, whose pupils included such pianists as Gary Grafman, Lillian Kallir, Jacob Leitner, and Sylvia Seremba, and such composers, conductors as Samuel Barber, Leonard Bernstein, Lucas Foss, and Thomas Sherman. Following a brief chapter of Bingirova's personality, the author presents the Bingirova system in respect to posture and hand position, singing tone, fingering, and pedaling. Here are some of the most important principles of piano technique summarized by Bingirova. The first principle is the basis of technique is sound production. Leschetizky taught his students to evoke a fine tone from the instrument and to make music and not noise. In his teaching, technique was just a tool to produce a beautiful musical tone. This principle was the main one of the Russian School of Music and is followed by many pianists for generations. In his book, The Notes from the Pianist's Bench, famous Russian pianist and pedagogue Boris Berman wrote, "Technique is the art of producing a beautiful sound." The next principle is non-percussive touch. The fingers are to be close to the keys and in contact with them before playing. In opposite to this, if we lift fingers high off the keys and hit, especially while using the force and tension, the sound will be percussive and not expressive. Whether playing with any touch, legato, non-legato, staccato, there should be a very brief moment of feeling the surface of the key before producing a sound to avoid the noise of hitting the key like a drumstick hits a drum. However, many teachers are convinced that the young students have to develop strong fingers and are teaching children to raise isolated fingers high and forcefully hit the keys, like in the following video. The resulting sound is self-evident. 有多高才多高啊？开，好的，太棒了，100分，开。The following principle of the unified modern technique is weight application. The correct application of weight in the key is essential, and we must teach students how to apply, distribute, and shift the weight of the body, and how to adjust it to produce different sounds, which in turn prevents using the force and tension. This illustration of the great virtuoso Franz Liszt shows the process of him playing the piano using the combination of body and arm weight with incredible finger work. The next principle is relaxation. All the muscles must be relaxed except those that are directly involved in sound production. We all know that playing even a single note makes our muscles contract. At the same time, even lowering the key is not possible without muscle contraction. Therefore, the most essential skill every pianist must learn is how to quickly and easily switch from tension to relaxation. If the muscles stay tensed for long periods of time, we will develop tiredness, soreness, and even injuries. Another powerful technical principle for pianists is the importance of having a quiet upper arm and flexible wrist. The flexibility and power of the wrist must be developed. Famous Russian pianist Dmitry Bashkirov compared pianist wrists with a second pair of lungs in the body. The arms will breathe as they follow the wrists. If the wrists are stiff, the sounds will be sterile and non-expressive. Let's watch one of my students, Chendi, who was 14 at the time the video was taken, performing Romance in D-flat major by Finnish composer Jan Sibelius. As you watch, please notice how she applies all the main principles of the unified modern technique summarized by Isabel Bingirova to her performance. Listen to the tone she produces. Notice the free movements of her body as she plays big chords and fast passages. The question is, when should we start teaching all these principles to our students? At what stage of their studies? Should we wait until the hand grows and reaches a certain size like some teachers suggest? Of course, no. We must begin teaching these skills from the very first lessons. A famous Russian pedagogue, Anna Artabalevskaya, said, I truly believe that the first stage of piano studies is the most important one in developing musicians. It's like planting a seed in a soil that could either grow into a big tree or dry out and die in the ground. We can all agree with this statement, but how do we explain to a young child at the beginning stages of studying piano all the principles of piano technique so they don't injure themselves when they get older and can play pieces that are technically and musically challenging? Special materials adapted and accessible for children are necessary. Unfortunately, during the Baroque and Classical eras, such materials were not available. Moreover, even the terms children and childhood weren't known until the middle of the 19th century. During pre-Romantic time, children were not considered to be their own beings. They were treated as mini adults. They wore adults' clothes and they were doing adult chores. Because of this belief, the music of Baroque and Classical era wasn't written for children, but for many adults. For example, instead of preludes and fugues, there are little preludes and fugues. Instead of sonatas, there are sonatinas. For the development of technique of many adults, the studies of Haydn, Bayer, and Czerny were used along with polyphonic pieces, classical and Baroque dances, and sonatinas. However, these materials were not suitable for the beginners. Teaching beginners depended entirely on individual teachers' musical background, philosophy, and approach. The first composers who wrote music specifically for children, about children and their inner world of fairy tales, fantasies, and toys were German composer Robert Schumann and Russian composer Peter Tchaikovsky in the middle of the 19th century. However, these wonderful pieces were also not written for early beginners. There was no sequential order from easy to more difficult, no introduction of basic technical skills, music theory, or note reading. In order to play pieces from these books, children would have to have had technical and musical skills that required at least several years of piano lessons. In the middle of 19th century, the popularity and the affordability of piano and piano lessons increased rapidly, which produced a big demand for piano teachers and the materials for beginners. In the late 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, many method books were published to help teachers and students around the world. In Russia and other countries of Eastern Europe, one of the first books for the beginners was the book of exercises and short pieces written by the Russian pedagogue Elena Gnessina. A few decades later, there came other books written by famous Russian pedagogues such as School of Piano Playing by Nikolaev and Method Book by Anna Artabalevskaya, which are still the main teaching books in Eastern Europe. At approximately the same time, method books were published in Western Europe. In France by composer and conductor Ernst van de Walde, another one by famous pianist Margaret Long. In Germany by Jacob Alexander Burckhardt and Fritz Emmond. In America, the Easiest Piano Course by John Thompson was published more than 100 years ago. A little later, Music for Piano by Robert Pace, and by the end of 20th century there were many more new methods by Alfred, Bastian, Faber and Faber, and others. In Asia, there were no method books for the beginners until recent decades, so the teachers started adopting and used Bayer's and Hennen's exercises and Czerny's Opus 599 with beginners. These books are still the main piano teaching books in Asia. In the late 20th century, John Thompson's Easiest Piano Course was translated to Mandarin, and soon after there came Alfred, Bastian, and Faber and Faber. As a young beginner, I studied with the Russian teaching books as others were simply not available in the former Soviet Union. As a young teacher, I had some serious concerns about the teaching materials, such as the books didn't look child-friendly. The pace of the introduction of the new concepts was too fast and soon would become overwhelming for majority of the students. On this slide, you see first tunes in the beginning of the book and the piece students would have to master at the end of the first year of piano studies. To create an engaging and interesting atmosphere at the lessons with the beginners, I had to invest hours and hours of my time preparing for each session, making up games, creating worksheets, thinking in advance of how to structure lessons so the child doesn't get bored or overwhelmed. I never questioned the Russian approach as it was the only one I knew. When I left Eastern Europe and moved to the USA, I was fascinated with all the piano methods available for children. I happily started using all of them. However, very soon I realized the method of teaching beginners was absolutely different than the Russian one. All the American method books were using five-finger position approach. The five-finger position is when the thumb is placed on a certain key and each of the consecutive fingers are placed on each consecutive white key. When piano lessons are started, students keep their hand in this position and play through pieces by just moving specific fingers and reading the music by finger numbers. It seemed pretty logical and attractive to me, especially considering how child-friendly all the books looked. They had artwork, lyrics to the songs, teachers' accompaniments, practice suggestions, not even mentioning each method included a separate book for music theory, technique, performance, worksheets, and audio tracks for each song. For a few months, I enjoyed teaching young beginners with these wonderful five-finger position method books until I realized there was something very wrong with my students. All of them started using isolated fingers despite my desperate attempts to teach them to support their fingers with the weight of their body and arms. They read music by finger numbers only, ignoring the notations. Their wrists, hands, and fingers were stiff as a rock. There was no musicality or artistry in their performances. In this picture of the hands of the beginner in five-finger position, we can already see the first signs of the bad technical habits that will develop in the future. All the fingers are stretched and tensed. The thumbs are laying flat on the keys. second fingers are isolated and raised to hit the keys from the above. Fifth fingers are stretched out and flat. An awkward twist in the wrist toward the center instead of being naturally curved away from the center. I must mention that what we see happening to the beginning students, for those who took lessons in five-finger position for a year or longer, became hardcore bad habits. Children struggled with tension, flat and collapsed fingers, poor sight reading, and terrible sound quality. Here are the video examples of a beginner's lesson in five-finger position and a second-year student's performance. You can see a number of problems with the beginner's hand position and sound production despite of teachers' attempts to help. With time, these issues turn into habits, as you can tell from the video of a second-year student. The older students get, the more bad habits they develop if not taught with the proper approach. Here are some of them noticed in my college students who had their initial training in five-finger position. Collapsed arch, stiff wrists, collapsed fingers, flat finger number 5 laying on its side. Thumb is also flat and on its side instead of the fingertip. Collapsed thumb's lower joint, and the other fingers are over-curved and tense while stretching to cover 5 keys. The worst nightmare for every person who plays musical instrument and for professional musicians is to injure their hands and become unable to play. Unfortunately, according to the latest studies in the USA, 93% of music college freshmen suffer from mild to severe forms of tendinitis, which is also called a repetitive stress injury. It develops over the time as one continues to do the same movements day after day for several years. If you are a musician and exercise diligently, repeating the wrong movements every time you practice, it puts a strain on your tendons, especially on the stiff wrist, and you develop this incurable condition. After extensive research and talking to many teachers and college students suffering from arm, wrist, shoulder, and hand pain, I've come to the conclusion that all these problems started developing from the very first lessons when young children had to stretch 5 little fingers over 5 grown-up sized piano keys and tense up to lift each finger in order to forcefully hit the key to produce a sound. The five-finger position method isn't known in the Russian and Eastern European piano schools. All the beginners start playing piano with only finger number 3 first. All the notes in the pieces are played with the same finger, which is conveniently located in the middle of the hand and at the end of the arm. While comparing the five-finger position methods with the Russian finger number 3 approach, I was stunned to realize that finger number 3 approach reflects all the main principles of the unified modern piano technique that was summarized by Isabel Bingirova. Playing with finger number 3 only, the students learn to switch from tension to relaxation after a single note to develop the habit of relaxation in the hand, wrist, and arm. To use the weight of the body and support it with the longest finger number 3 while feeling balanced and centered. To develop wrist flexibility and healthy arm alignment. While moving from note to note with finger number 3 leading from the wrist and keeping the fingers close to the keys, students are able to produce non-percussive and beautiful sound from the very first lessons. Following all these principles in the beginning of the studies, we are developing the first fundamental articulation, non-legato. Execution of a proper non-legato is very complex. It consists of 3 stages. The first stage is preparatory, when the wrist goes up while we breathe in. The second and the main stage is breathing out while gently dropping the natural body weight into the key, supported by a finger. The third and final stage is breathing in and releasing tension. Here is the video demonstration of these 3 steps of non-legato. Preparatory stage. Breathe in, wrist goes up. Main stage. Breathe out, gently drop natural body weight in the key, supported by a finger. Listen to the beginning duration and the end of every sound. Third final stage. Breathe in, release tension, wrist up. After the students feel comfortable with a single note played non-legato with finger number 3, they should try a series of notes played by the same finger number 3 while combining the first and third stages of non-legato, preparation and relaxation, while between the notes, thus playing with more economical movements. As tempo increases, our preparatory motion will be fused with the relaxation movements. Here is the video snippet from my 4th lesson with 3.5-year-old Audrey. Even though she is so young and in her first lessons, she is already on the way to developing proper non-legato playing with finger number 3. Notice her flexible wrists, non-percussive touch, and starting to form understanding of the weight and relaxation. Understanding the differences and experiencing the results from finger number 3 and 5 finger position approaches firsthand left me with no doubt for my choice of the method for developing piano technique in students at the initial stages. I didn't want to risk the physical health and the future of my young beginners with 5 finger position materials. But how could I make the learning process enjoyable and fun while starting from finger number 3? I thought newer American method books were quite good engaging child's imagination by having artwork, lyrics, practice suggestions, everything that the Russian materials didn't have. Nevertheless, despite of all the colorful pages, many students who study with American method books have no motivation to practice, no artistry or emotional connection with the pieces, poor sight reading skills, and because of the fear to step away from the 5 finger position, they have very limited repertoire choices, as original classical pieces are not written within one 5 finger position. It was clear to me that my research had to continue. I started studying the ways children learn. My discoveries were quite shocking because I realized that myself, in the beginning of my studies, I was forced to learn like an adult, which made the learning process not very enjoyable. What I've discovered from many sources is that children don't perceive music the same way as adults. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio wrote in his book Emotion, Reason, and Human Brain, quote, "The child's music perception starts as a feeling of what happens through the sound." End of quote. In another book, Music in Early Childhood, the author John Fairbairn, who is a specialist in early brain development, writes, quote, "Not all children are preparing to become professional musicians, but all of them live through the musical experiences that shape their emotional learning. That's why reducing music to the exercises is not going to teach children how to play music, because such exercises will not provide an emotional foundation for music making." End of quote. Moreover, a variety of research shows that children's learning style is completely opposite to an adult's. Children learn intuitively, subconsciously, through imagination, touch, vision, and sound. Adults learn by explanation and demonstration, logic, and consciousness. In this short video clip, we will see how a baby learns to eat with a spoon. The habit is gradually developing by intuition, touch, vision, and experimentation.
How to teach your baby to feed themselves. With a little practice and coordination, your child will be eating independently in no time. Step 4. Introduce them to a baby spoon once they can pick up food with their fingers. Step 5. Put food on the spoon and help them put it in their mouth. Step 6. Let them practice feeding themselves. Some food will surely end up in their hair and on the floor, but with practice, it will eventually end up in their mouth. Step 7. Encourage them to keep trying.
The same happens when children start to learn to play the piano. The more natural and closer to everyday life experiences the technical and musical concepts are, the more intuition, experiences, images, and analogies get involved in the lessons and home practice. the faster and better children learn and the more comfortable and organic they will feel at the piano. But let's look at a page of an American method book introducing C major five-finger position. Just imagine one of the first piano lessons in the child's life when they have to clap and count the rhythm aloud. Find the position for both hands. Play and say the note names. Play again and count the rhythm aloud. And then play 5 notes up from middle C and back. Is there anything that the child can use imagination, intuition, or life experience? What is this tune about? How is the child supposed to connect emotionally with this song? There are none, just a dry, unemotional, unexpressive exercise in five-finger position. Because of this style of introduction of the new concepts in the books, many teachers treat their students and expect them to learn the same way as adults, through abstract definitions, boring explanations, demonstrations, and repetitions. A few years ago, I was contacted by the parent of a 5-year-old girl who took piano lessons for a year prior. The mom told me her daughter didn't want to practice piano and was crying every time she had to. The parent was inquiring if I could find a different approach and get her little girl interested in piano lessons, because she used to love it until she started piano lessons. I was very curious to see what this child was so upset about when playing piano, and scheduled a meeting with the girl and her mom. After a few seconds of listening to little Catherine playing dry, unexpressive exercises in five-finger position, I was ready to cry myself. Let's watch the video of our first meeting with Catherine and her mom. Show me what you can play, honey, how you're playing. Good girl. Very good. Even though I was very cautious of taking that girl after the whole year of piano lessons and having already developed a dislike to music and practice, I decided to give it a try. After a few months of working with Catherine using my curriculum, Tales of a Musical Journey, this shy, bored, uninterested girl became one of my most outgoing, joyful, and delightful students. In this next video, taken 2 years later after original meeting, Catherine is 7-year-old and performing at the closing concert of Carmel Clavier International Competition as the first place winner for her age category. She is playing Let's Boogie by an American composer, Eugene Rocherol. We teach students accordingly to their style of learning, provide musical materials that uses vivid images, allowing children to connect with their pieces on emotional level, teaching them to feel comfortable at the piano by developing proper technical habits, nurturing their natural abilities through creative activities. Our students will learn to appreciate music, to play without tension using healthy injury preventive technique, to enjoy the learning process, to play by ear, to improvise and compose, and to read notes. And all of these were my goals in creating and writing the curriculum Tales of a Musical Journey. Tales of a Musical Journey series became children's reading, technique, theory, composition, ear training, and performance books all in one. The series is designed to make the learning process enjoyable, concepts easy to understand and remember due to the use of the fairy tale stories and many different props. The content is entertaining. More advanced technical skills are naturally evolving from the previously learned ones, while we start with proper posture and playing first tunes with non-legato with finger number 3. With an enthusiastic teacher, the students engage their imagination and creative thinking. They become active participants and not passive observers at the lessons and during home practice. Since 2010, Tales of a Musical Journey has been translated by piano teachers into 14 languages and is currently being taught in 92 countries. At the beginning of this session, I mentioned that even though I graduated with 4 degrees, what became my passion was pedagogy, and it continues to this day. Because of my passion, the Gorin Institute was founded in 2019 in order to be able to communicate the main principles of piano pedagogy to teachers all over the world. I am very excited to be able to offer pedagogy courses and professional development courses where piano teachers will explore in depth the many areas I touched on today, beginning with non-legato and progressing to more advanced articulations and skills, including composition, improvisation, ear training, and such. Some individual pedagogy sessions are also available. Through the power of the internet, teachers can participate no matter what part of the world they call home. I hope this information I've shared with you today will inspire you and give you the food for thought. IrinaGorin.com website is the shop where you can find Tales of a Musical Journey in English and all the translations, as well as many supplemental props, toys, books, and sheet music for beginning through advanced levels. If you are interested in exploring more about this curriculum, please join Facebook group called Tales of a Musical Journey and Beyond, where almost 6,000 piano teachers from all over the world discuss many different issues in an encouraging and supportive atmosphere. Best wishes to all of you. I hope you enjoy and love your amazing job of a piano teacher and cherish the difference you make in every student's life.